How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, awesome. As you know, I took part of Dr. Bob's. They call it the second annual environmental and genomic conference, and they talked a lot about, which of course you should be talking for. You just didn't volunteer like I did, but they talked a lot about the phase two gene SNPs and how that relates to mold toxicity. And then I looked at my own gene SNPs and saw major challenges with glucuronidation. And I've been told I have Gilbert syndrome, which is typically just a sort of default diagnosis as, well, your bilirubin's kind of high, but your liver enzymes are normal, so don't worry about it, kind of thing. So I said, hey, let's come up with a good topic of the toxic accumulator and then talk about how that may relate to just the environment we live in, John, with xenobiotics and all of these plastics and these hydrocarbons, and especially with the folks out in California with the fumes and the exhaust. So that's what I figured would be a great topic to talk
Yeah,
about today.
yeah. It's always a great topic, and I think it's a great topic because the thing is it's something that has to be on everybody's radar every single day. Because of all the things we're exposed to, and so what happens a lot of times is, talk to different clients, different patients, and or different people, and they're like, "Hey, we're doing a detox." It's like it's thought of as like a short-term kind of support thing where you're detoxifying all the time, and your liver is going through that process to really cope with the environment that you're around. And you mentioned all those different things we get exposed to, and it's a toxic world. You're not going to eliminate the exposure of those things unless you live in a bubble. So you've got to support these pathways on an ongoing basis. And then if you have, like you mentioned, if you have specific gene variants where you're maybe a little bit weaker in certain spots versus the next person, those are things that you really have to consider maybe supporting a little bit more aggressive based on that, because it's a process where you got to kind of go from point A to point Z, or kind of phase one through that phase three detoxification. And there's multiple steps along the way. And if you're not able to, eliminate or get from one step to the next, that can be problematic. And that's where you get a lot of reabsorption and a lot of the inability to transition from phase one to phase two, and then phase two into 2.5 into 3. You get that reabsorption of those toxins. Those toxins go to the brain, to the nervous system, to the muscles, and that's where a lot of the symptoms and diagnoses set in when somebody is not able to detoxify properly. So, I always try and tell my clients that, hey, don't use the word detox in terms of like a short-term thing. Like you're doing a detox for like a week or a month and it's done. We got to make sure that we're supporting those pathways on an ongoing basis to cope with the environment that we live in that is not getting better. It's only getting worse.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if there is a definition of a verb in terms of it's happening all the time, I think detox is really a verb. And we
Yeah.
have to make sure that breaking it down into simplicity, you're releasing or letting go of more toxins on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or monthly basis or yearly basis than you're taking in. And just being involved, like you said, if you're not living in a bubble and you live in the world that we live in, the environment is everything else besides your body. The environment is toxic. So
Yeah.
why don't we do this? So we have this new format where we do a podcast while we answer the questions. I think we're still gathering momentum here in our Facebook group.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it's best to transport this into a podcast and then come back and see if there's any questions, or if you happen to watch this on the replay, by certainly put in your suggestions, we will come around and answer, or your questions, we will come back around and answer your questions that you may see after that you watch this replay. So why don't we do this? Why don't we just do an introduction to the intro of our podcast and then kind of go right into it?
All right. Why don't you introduce us?
All right, here we go. So, all right. So 3 and 2 and 1. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Your Genetic Type podcast, where Dr. John Thomas and I are going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about detoxification and the role that plays with your chronic health challenge. Perhaps you're not aware of the different nuances that we require proper gene function to be able to eliminate the chemicals that we get exposed to on a day-to-day basis. But you may also not realize that there is a perfect storm with the environmental exposures of things you're not even aware of that ultimately create a discrepancy between the buildup of toxins and the release of toxins. So, John, why don't you kind of get us into, first and foremost, what is the toxic accumulator? We have the genetic type, and we have 7 different types, and we have one type that is specifically called the toxic accumulator. So why don't you get into that?
Yeah, so the toxic accumulator a lot of times is that person that they know going into it that they just don't detox. And I hear that from clients all the time. They say, I can't detox. And they're told that by different practitioners they work with. They kind of feel in their body. And somebody that is kind of that toxic accumulator, they're going to have issues where they start losing tolerance to their environment. Okay, and these are people that start developing a lot of sensitivity to fragrances. They walk into a room and they know that, oh, wow, there's mold in here. They start losing more and more oral tolerance to food aspects. And a lot of that is because there's issues from a genetic standpoint in the detoxification process. And we kind of, start off this, before we kind of went to the podcast aspect, talking about that definition of detox is used very, very loosely. And there's multiple pieces to that puzzle, and it's one of those things where it's got to be supported on an ongoing basis based on the world we live in. And so what we found out, working with clients, especially with a real focus in genetics, is a lot of those people that have a lot of those symptoms where they're losing tolerance to their environment, or they are or you run certain lab tests and it's like they're not able to clear heavy metals, or they're not able to clear certain chemicals. There's some specific gene variants that a lot of those people have, and a lot of those gene variants deal with issues in phase 1, phase 2, as well as into other aspects of detoxification, like peroxidation and that phase 2.5 component that deals with that bile utilization, and getting those toxins from the liver into the gut. And so what I've seen over the years, and I know you've seen the same thing, is these people that are trying to do these kind of general detoxes, or they're trying to follow, different gut protocols to get their gut. There's a lot of issues from a genetic standpoint that have to maybe be supported a little more aggressively based on specific genetic weakness, so that they're able to truly detoxify and eliminate those toxins that are exposed to start kind of changing that tolerance to their surroundings and their environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you don't even have to have genetic weaknesses any longer to be a toxic accumulator, just because the cars, I always think about you and living in Georgia, and when it's pollen season, and you mentioned that you don't have very many genetic polymorphisms to be able to clear out the extracellular histamine, it doesn't matter. And we use the example all the time on the lanes on the highway. You may have an 8-lane highway, which is a fully functioning highway, but the Super Bowl is let out, and you just, doesn't matter how many lanes there are, you can't get by. That's kind of the analogy of how toxic our world is, between the forest fires in California and the chemicals and sprays and pesticides they put in the soils, to the medications and xenobiotics, to disruptors, basically all over the place. And so, all right, so then as far as when someone is dealing with a toxic accumulation, you're saying that ultimately they know, right? They know that I'm not a good detoxer. Why don't you get into, if they don't know, and what you would maybe see some of the symptoms that they may not put 2 and 2 together with, just so that people that don't identify them, well, this is not for me, I don't have a problem with detoxing. How will it also manifest in terms of what's the connection between that and their chief complaints?
Yeah, so like I said, a lot of people know that they're poor detoxifiers just because they feel effects, and maybe somebody doesn't know this because maybe they haven't kind of gone down this road, right? Maybe they have fatigue issues, they have hormone imbalances, they told they have a thyroid disorder, they have some autoimmune issue, and they've never really kind of associated the triggers, right? Or they've never associated the how these stressors, whether it be something that's an infection or something environmental, chemical, how that plays into driving that condition that's going on. And so we always kind of hear that kind of Herxheimer reaction, right? Where, all right, there's that detox effect that someone has when they start pushing those pathways maybe a little faster than their body can tolerate. My thought process over the years has really changed on that, where, if you're having some of those adverse response, it's kind of maybe your body's way of telling you that there's a missing piece to it. Okay. And so through proper detoxification, you should know that, hey, there's little to no worsening of symptoms, but there's improvement through the process, right? And if there is a significant like detox effect, that's one of the biggest warning signs. If somebody jumps in, or they start taking a liver nutrient, or they taken something in the past from a supplemental side of thing that dealt with detoxification, and maybe they didn't chalk it up that they were a poor detoxifier, but what they did is they just pushed certain pathways faster than other things further downstream could tolerate or keep up with that load. And when that happens, you get a lot of reabsorption of those chemicals, where your phase 1 breaks these down into more water soluble components, and then that phase 2 is supposed to eliminate it and dump it into the gut. And if there's issues there, there's that massive reabsorption, and you get that immune activation, you get the symptoms that mediate from that. And so that's probably the biggest thing, I think, that people may not kind of have that awareness. Maybe they've tried to do something in the past, or they take some of the past that sped up those pathways, and they had an ill effect to it, and thought maybe that, hey, I'm just reacting to this product, not understanding that there might be certain amino acids, or there might be certain antioxidants in that product that push some of these detox pathways faster than their body can tolerate it further downstream.
Yeah, I find that a lot. And I like what you said too, in terms of if you have someone who can't go into a fragrance store, or they can't be around solvents or paints or chemicals or gas, and they get or a moldy building and they get an instant headache, it's a pretty good sign that they have challenges. One of the really reminders that I had from that webinar that Dr. Bob Miller, or the summit that he did, was before they start to implement a detoxification protocol, is to make sure that they have effective bowel movements or elimination first. So maybe talk a little bit about that, where, hey, there is the possibility of having a Herxheimer reaction, where people will call it a paradoxical reaction, where they, I wasn't supposed to happen like that, but meanwhile, they didn't do their due diligence, so to speak, in terms of getting ready to start pushing those pathways. So maybe let's talk about that, John, in terms of how do we know, or how do we progress or titrate up someone from, okay, we know you have detoxification issues, but this is the likewise process that we're going to take to do that.
Yeah, and so when we're talking about like detoxification, and I just can't stress enough that it's one of those things. Like you mentioned with like Bob, they talk about like detox protocols. Yes, there's detox protocols you're going to do to get a little more aggressive, but there's things you got to do on an ongoing basis. But to kind of think of like detoxification, and really what we're talking about is how the liver is basically coping with the chemicals that we're exposed to, right? And that's basically what detoxification is. There's really 4 steps. Most people understand that it's really 3 steps, but it's really 4 steps with that kind of bile aspect that, we'll talk to Dr. Kelly Halderman about. She's really kind of doing a lot of research and formulation on products that support that phase 2.5. But there's 4 main steps in this process. You get exposed to a toxin. It's going to enter the liver, go through phase 1, go through phase 2, go through phase 2.5, which is that kind of that bile utilization, and that kind of dumping of those toxins from the liver into the gut, as well as, obviously in phase 2, then some is excreted out to the kidneys as well. But then once everything's dumped from the liver into the gut, you got that phase 3, which is elimination, right? And the problem is, a lot of people will buy liver support, or they'll get on a detoxification protocol that's really formulated to support maybe phase 2 only, right? You talk about things like, B vitamins and milk thistle and glutathione and all those nutrients that really support the phase 2 aspects, but they're really not doing anything to support further upstream or further downstream, okay? And you really have to be supporting kind of all 4 of those steps. And so what I tend to like to do is I like to work backwards, right? Because if you're taking from further up and you're starting to funnel down, if there's a step below that that's not being supported or working properly, that's where the problem can lie. That's where that reabsorption of chemicals and toxins happens. And then that's where you can get, those chemicals get embedded in tissues and have those detox effects. And so you got to really make sure that not necessarily the gut's got to be working properly, because a lot of people that have poor detoxification issues are going to have support gut function. And it's kind of like a vicious cycle. It's like, or that chicken and egg scenario. What do you fix first? Do you support the liver aspects, or do you support the gut component? If you're dumping toxins in the gut, it's going to continue to disrupt your gut microbiome. So if you're trying to just fix the guts and the liver is just dumping toxins, faster than your gut can tolerate, you're just going to re-destroy the gut bacteria. So really what we talk about in that phase 3 are binders, right? Things that kind of bind or mop up the chemicals that are being dumped into the liver when it's needed. And then we work further upstream from that is what's going on with gallbladder function, right? What's going on, or more specifically, bile function, because we know bile is what moves those toxins from the liver into the gut for that elimination, okay? And a lot of people have had gallbladders out, and the thought process is, well, the liver makes enough to cope up with it, but hey, we live in a toxic world, right? More traffic on the road, okay? So you've got to be doing things to support, that bile formation, that bile utilization, as well as how effective bile can, effectively dump those things from phase 2 into the gut for proper elimination. And then the typical things that people are taking for liver are really things to support that phase 2 process. And if you're not supporting that bile process that deals with the dumping from the liver to the gut, or if you're not have adequate binders, you're kind of playing with fire, because you're gonna speed up phase 2. And if that 2.5 bile utilization, or that binding or that elimination process isn't working properly or supported properly to keep up with that increased demand, that's where a lot of that reabsorption can happen, and that's where the problem can lie. And then you work up further upstream to phase 1, and there's specific things you do there to help the body recognize those chemicals, turn those chemicals into free radicals, and further water soluble components that can be bumped into phase 2. And so that you really have to be supporting kind of all 4 steps of the process. And what I see a lot of the times, and I know you've seen this, is you've had patients that have like, oh, I can't detox, or I've done a detox and that didn't work for me, or I've already detoxed and I'm still having these symptoms, but then there was missing pieces, right? They just, they did a shake, or they did a product, or they did a protocol that was really focused on like phase 2 only, and that phase 2.5 or that phase 3 wasn't supported. And probably what they did is they eliminated some, but a lot of it just got reabsorbed, which is why they're still having symptoms.
Yeah, it's a really great point. I looked at some of the case studies, and one of the things that I saw a big discrepancy with how I approach the clients that I work with versus how they approach the clients they work with. I like what you just mentioned from the bottom up, in terms of, okay, let's get the bile, let's bind this. And Kelly talks about an insurance policy to mop up the extra toxins that your kidney and your liver aren't able to do. But what I saw is the titration of pushing those binders, like the actual dosing of those binders. So maybe talk about what binders are, and how to go about. Obviously, this isn't specific recommendations for just anyone out there. This is just a conceptual idea as to what you can do to support your bottom-up protocol of detoxification, with starting with binders. So maybe talk a little bit about what binders are, and then maybe a little bit interest in your part in terms of how much, John, do you push clients with different quantities or different types in terms of what binders are, and how you work up from there?
Yeah, so a lot of people understand, or maybe they don't understand what binders are, and basically there's different components that don't get absorbed in the gut when you take them orally, and they have a great ability to attach to chemicals and metals and things like that. It's almost like a magnet, right? You got this kind of nutrient like magnet that you're going to swallow, and it doesn't really wreak any havoc on the body, but if there is something that can gravitate towards it, it's going to lock it up, and it's not going to let go, right? And then eventually you're going to pass that through your stool, and then that chemical is eliminated. And so there's certain binders that are pretty standard. There's charcoal, or activated charcoal. There's different zeolites. There's bentonite clays. There's other nutrients that can have detoxification effects and kind of mimic binders, like chlorella. There's things like fulvic acid that can kind of mimic kind of the binding effect. But some of the core binders are things like charcoal, clay, as well as zeolite aspects are the true kind of binders. If you look at most formulations that are out there from a supplemental form, they're going to contain one or all of those products to really help mop up, or kind of attached to those things that are done from the liver so that they don't get absorbed. Because what happens is once they're attached, like I said, that charcoal, that bigger molecule zeolite, that bigger molecule clay, it's not going to absorb across the gut barrier. So once it attaches to that chemical or toxin, that chemical is not going to be able to get through the gut barrier now. It's going to actually have to go with that binder through proper elimination. And so when we talk about kind of working backwards, it's not one of those scenarios where it's like, okay, you have to like focus on this binding thing for like, weeks or months on end, right? It just like means that you have to have some binders in the mix. And when you talk about kind of dosage wise, what's great about it is you got a binder in the mix, and then you can start kind of working upstream, layer in bioutilization support, layer in some of the phase 2 support, which is going to be things like your, certain amino acids and your B vitamins and glutathione components, and then work into your phase 1, which is going to be some of those nutrients like the milk thistle, certain antioxidants. You can then kind of add those things in pretty quickly. And then what happens is if you start having certain detoxification effects, then what a lot of times you do is you can maybe back off the new support that you did and increase the binders. And a lot of times that allows somebody to go through a detoxification process that's maybe a little bit more aggressive than just a general daily support standpoint, to be able to go through it where there's minimal side effects. And they kind of go through where it's like, hey, I'm not noticing anything, but hey, things each week are trending in a better direction. And so what's great is, we always talk about, like from a genetic standpoint, about pulsing nutrients, right? When you're talking about detoxification, listen to your body. If you're starting to have certain detoxification effects, headaches or energy crashes, muscle pain, things of that nature, hey, there's maybe reabsorption and immune activation. Maybe you got to up the binders a little bit and slow down some of the nutrients for phase 1 and phase 2 to kind of find that sweet spot for you, because there's not a specific set protocol. It's not a cookie cutter approach that's a one size fits all. And that's where the genetic component comes in, because we can look at genetics and say, hey, you have a lot of these issues maybe in phase 1, or maybe you have a lot of genetic issues in phase 2, or these issues in that kind of bile aspect. Maybe we got to, hit that support a little harder. And if you do start having some ill effects, we at least know where we have to kind of turn the dial up, right? We have to kind of turn the dosage up to really help that process from A to Z work as most effective as possible, so there's not that detoxification or kind of perk reaction.
Yeah, it's a really great commentary that you have there, John. The thing that I think is also now evolving is those phase 2 specific pathways. So you have, not to get too ABC on people, but you have, these different pathways like glucuronidation or sulfation, acetylation, glutathione conjugation, amino acid conjugation, methylation, all these pathways. And for myself now, I still have my mercury fillings, and I think people still understand that, okay, detoxification is for if you have heavy metals, or detoxification is if you just got exposed to a major chemical and you need to detoxify. But we're saying that if you've been around this planet for long enough to kind of evolve as the chemicals have gotten more sophisticated and more abundant, then you don't need a specific exposure that you're aware of or a heavy metal that you're aware of, and you can be darn sure that you have it, for sure. But then you look at what specific phase 2 pathways are more suitable for, like, for example, some phase 2 pathways may be more helpful for hormone breakdown, or some phase 2 so if someone's on bioidenticals, that's where the doctor has to put on the doctor hat and say, hey, this, why is that cup continually to be pouring in and overflowing when we're doing these supports that are helping you drain that bucket that you may need some extra support with, but you're not doing it at as fast a rate as what you're pouring into. And that's where you need a good clinician to understand, hey, that bioidentical that you're taking because you're fatigued and exhausted is a catch-22, because it continues to drain or overflow your detox bucket, and we're not able to support it at a fast enough rate. So I think it's important, obviously, to know what are the things going into it on a day-to-day basis. Like, what are the medications that you're taking, or what is the protocols that you're doing? Actually, John, I just had someone today tell me that they've been on supplements since they've been 16 years old, and they're in their 30s and 40s, and they just happened to run out of their supplements, and haven't filled it up, and they've noticed that, hey, my rashes and my itchiness are actually getting better. So sometimes also you need to detox from your protocols that you're doing as well.
Yeah.
So what I guess in all of that long, what's the word, dissertation that I'm doing there, as far as, have you started to look at that yourself, you know, in terms of, hey, let's look at those phase 2 things or pathways, even though we're layering in binders, even though we're looking at bile support, now that we're going to even potentially help lymphatics. Maybe we can talk about lymphatics too and the role they play. But are you starting to look more at the genetic component with the specific phase 2 pathways like acetylation and the other pathways as well?
Well, you know the answer to that, of course, man.
Well, I want to, you know, the other people don't know that answer, so you know.
So yeah, you know, that's what our, you know, our focus and our specialty is in the genetic aspect. And here's the thing is we're talking about like a lot of these genes that a lot of people are talking about, like MTHFR, right? And you're talking about genes like PEMT that deal with choline, you know, production, and so, you know, those are genetic factors that play into those pathways that you listed. And so when we're looking at genetics and we're looking at genetics from a nutritional perspective in terms of how the body's functioning, most of these genes that are talked about, you know, really deal in this liver detoxification process. And, you know, anything that you look at that deals with like glutathione production, right, or in glutathione recycling utilization, it's like, you know, that is the liver function that kind of falls in this detoxification process. And so, you know, I always tell patients that aspect, you know, that, hey, like, okay, we're talking about these genes where you have some of these big factors genetically that could be possibilities that we got to maybe consider supporting a little bit differently, a little more aggressively. You know, this all kind of falls back to liver function at some level, and you know, or liver function, you know, at a totality aspect, right? And so, yeah, you know, you have to kind of understand that when you're looking at genetic factors, you know, it is dealing with how your body is functioning, but a lot of it is really looking at how these detox pathways are functioning. And so if you have an MTHFR defect, or you've got a, you know, something that deals with glutathione utilization, or you've got issues with acetylation, and you're not able to adequately, you know, break down and utilize fats and proteins, you know, that is going to hinder detoxification, specifically in that phase 2 process. And, you know, maybe the last thing you want to do is go speeding that up, not knowing the rest of the story in terms of how do things feed into it from phase 1, and then also further downstream, how does your body eliminate it if you do speed up, where you've had these maybe genetic factors your whole life that have had you've been a slow detoxifier, and now you're speeding those processes up the first time in your life. You know, a lot of things can go haywire, you know, and so that's where genetics really kind of be a missing piece, because it can really show you, like, and I mentioned earlier, you know, it really gives a missing piece of the puzzle that can really show you when things aren't responding the way they should. You can kind of go back to that individual's biochemistry based on their genetic predisposition and have an understanding of, like, okay, this is why you're responding this way. We got to maybe ramp this up or ramp this down because there's some genetic weakness here, and we're actually moving that traffic too fast, or we're kind of creating more of a traffic jam further down the road that's leading to this individual experience.
Yeah, it's a great point. So to recap, so it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be detoxing from metals, or you have an exposure to a chemical specifically. In the world we live in, we need to think of it as a verb. And it's something that you want to make sure that you understand, not just looking at your liver enzymes, and if they're elevated, it's a problem. If they're not, it's not a problem. It's taking the whole story into context and understanding, specifically with people that are dealing with a chronic health issue that no one's helping. And you see it, I see it all the time. I've spent tens of thousands of dollars. I've spent on doctors, on tests, and nothing's moving the needle. That's where you need to play at this level and understand all of the nuances. So I'm going to switch it up a little bit, John. And for someone that may not, again, believe that they have a detox issue, even with all that we said, maybe talk about what Kelly talked about when she talked at the Perfect Storm Summit, about the role of weight loss resistance and how that may have to tie into, well, there's a detox problem there. So if you have someone that's not losing the weight and they're doing all the things they should be doing with their diet, they're active, they're exercising, and the needle is not moving, then kind of tie those strings together and explain to them what's going on there.
Yeah, and so Kelly talked a lot about this when we interviewed it. It's something that's kind of been on our radar for a while. Is when you're talking about detoxification, I think one of the biggest missing pieces that's not considered, not supported, is that phase 2.5 pathway, right? And maybe somebody's never heard of that phase 2.5, which is basically that kind of transition phase from the liver to the gut, right? And if you can't get those chemicals that your phase 1 and phase 2 have, done a great job of breaking down and conjugating and getting ready for elimination, and you can't move them adequately from the liver into the guts, well, there's going to be massive reabsorption of those chemicals, right? The liver's not going to allow them to hang around. They're going to get embedded in different tissues and be problematic. And so when you're talking about metabolism and weight, a lot of times what happens is some of those chemicals that then get reabsorbed and get embedded in things like the brain and nervous, system and, muscle tissue, a lot of them also get embedded in fat. And so what happens is your body will start producing more fat to help keep up with that increased reabsorption of those chemicals because of inadequate bile utilization in terms of how you're able to use bile to transition those chemicals that have been properly kind of churned down into water-soluble components, water-soluble metabolites, and then conjugated in phase 2, and now they're ready to dump into the gut for elimination. If you can't transition from the liver to the gut, that's a huge problem. So that's one big thing I've seen over the years with detoxification, and especially we're talking about metabolism. You're talking about weight, you're talking about fatigue aspects. That bile aspect is so darn important to be supported with any type of detoxification protocol, because it could be kind of a make it or break it in terms of having the goal reach of what you're trying to accomplish by taking those nutrients and doing that detoxification protocol that's maybe a little more aggressive than what the daily nutrient support should be.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I think that if you are a man or a woman and you are having difficulty with losing weight, then you have to understand that you have a detoxification issue, and your body is preserving the toxic accumulation by not dumping those toxins, because it's like, look, you just don't have the capacity to move this out of the body. You're just going to reabsorb it, and it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, so to speak. So we're just going to let it in the adipose tissue until you start to move, or at least get that bile flowing, get those binders in there. So, okay, great. So as far as the genetic testing, why don't we talk a little bit about that in terms of, I know I know the answer to these questions, but some of the people don't. So how do they go about testing? I mean, what is a genetic test? Can they just do MTHFR, or is there a better way of doing it?
Yeah, there's a much better way. A lot of people have been testing for MTHFR, and they're told that they have a methylation or detoxification issue based on that gene alone. And that is true, right? Because MTHFR does play into this in terms of that methylation process that plays into some of this, liver and detoxification aspects. But there's more to the story, right? We talked about B vitamins, we talked about MTHFR, I mentioned it, but we also talked about a lot of other stories, right? We talked about, phase 1, which are your cytochrome P450 enzymes, which are responsible for really taking chemicals and turning them into free radicals through an oxidation process. And then you have other genes that deal with acetylation and genes that deal with glutathione utilization and conjugation. And you got genes that deal with that kind of bile utilization aspect. And so looking at MTHFR alone is an injustice, because if you're and that's what I see all the time. People get diagnosed with MTHFR, they put on the prescription Deplin, which is a very, very high dose prescription-based methylfolate, and boom, after taking it one time, it's like the floodgates open, right? They just, they feel so much worse in terms of anxiety or pain levels or sleep issues, just because things were pushed faster than the body can tolerate because there were other things that weren't investigated in the process. So there's different ways to look at some of these other gene factors that are very important to understand where's your weak link in the chain, right? Where does your highway narrow down and create a bottleneck that maybe you got to support a little more aggressively? Maybe somebody's done 23andMe or Ancestry.com. Both 23andMe.com and Ancestry.com, they have genetic information in there to get that ancestry information And both of those tests have a good portion of this information we're talking about. Does it have everything? No, but it does have enough to scratch the surface that if you've already done those tests, you can take that data and run it through an interpretation platform that's, you know, a third-party site, and look to see if you have weakness in some of these genes, you know, that deal with these pathways. You know, the test that we prefer, since 23andMe and Ancestry's, you know, is kind of stripped down, is the, you know, the functional genomic analysis test, which, you know, was created by Bob Miller, who's a mentor of both of us. You know, and that's, to me, kind of the gold standard until something else comes out, because I haven't seen anything yet that is as in-depth at the very, very low price point that that test is, that's going to give you all this information. And what's really great about that test is the report that it gives really breaks down what we're talking about here. It'll show you, you know, hey, here's a section that deals with glutathione. Here's a section that deals with this bile utilization process. And if you see a lot of 1s or 2s in there, a lot of variants in there, boom, that tells you right out of the gate, like, you know, flashing light, okay, this is problematic. This could be the missing piece of the puzzle that needs to be supported, you know. And then definitely if you tried to do a detox previously and it ill effects, that was probably the missing piece of why you had ill effects in the first place.
Right, exactly. And I think that's why we continue to give these educational resources, so that the exhausted person doesn't just continue to throw crap at the wall and hope that it sticks.
Exactly.
Right, and I think that with the supplement companies have good intentions in that they create these cookie cutter programs for detoxification, because in general they're going to be helpful. They're going to have nutrients that phase 2, phase 3, and phase 1 all can be upregulated or support. But we're talking about, everyone understands that I'm different. Like, you didn't live in the same stressful, environmental, toxic, like crappy supplement relationship, all of the above, that I need to customize my recovery program around my own challenges. So I agree 100% in terms of getting the functional genomic analysis test, looking at the reports, and those are things that we can supply for you at yourgenetictype.com. So why don't we talk a little bit about that, John, the tools that we have, both the testing and the free quiz, and even the getting into the nutritional support for customization aspect.
Yeah, so what kind of started this, we kind of, you know, started talking about the toxic accumulator, right? And that really kind of falls into the detoxification. But, you know, everybody needs to support detox pathways. Everybody, you know, even if somebody has some other issues and they're not that toxic accumulator genetic type, you know, there's still a need to support detoxification. Like I said, we don't want to think in terms of detox as a short-term thing, right? It's not a detox protocol you're going to do for a week and then be done. Yes, there's things you can do more aggressively to get after certain chemicals more aggressively, but that detoxification aspect is something that needs to be supported every single day through diet, or, you know, if the diet's not there, through supplementation, especially when you talk about understanding your genetic predisposition and how you can really individualize this specific for you, right? And support those lanes that are really narrowed down, or that weak link in the chain per se. So what we've done over the years is, you know, by, you know, having practices that really focus on genetics, we realize that, hey, there's these kind of categorizations that a lot of people kind of fall into. And one of the genetic types is a toxic accumulator. And that is somebody that really just is a poor detoxifier, meaning that, you know, anything they're exposed to, it's like their body's not eliminating it, their body's just storing. They've been doing that for years and decades. And basically they've lost tolerance to their environment. That's what the toxic accumulator is, right? But there's other genetic types. We've classified that there's 7 core genetic types, and everybody fits, for the most part, into 1 or 2 of those. And that really gives them a little bit of a roadmap in terms of looking at a comprehensive genetic test, or looking at something like 23andMe or Ancestry.com or Dr. Lynch's Strategene, and saying, hey, I've got these gene variants that are here. Now, what's my next step? What does it mean, right? And so we figured, all right, what's a way to make this very easy and user-friendly for somebody to kind of look at a genetic report on their own and kind of determine what those next steps are for them, right? It's not the 100% answer, you know, all the time, but it does give them what are those next steps and what are those foundational things that somebody maybe needs to do. And that's where that your genetic type concept evolved from. And what we've provided on our website, yourgenetictype.com, is a free quiz which you can take that can go in and tell you what your genetic type is. And then from there, you can look at a genetic report and determine, hey, I'm a histamine type, or I'm a toxic accumulator type. what are the handful of genes that are the ones that you need to look at first? Okay. And what we've done was provided educational courses that you can, purchase and take. They're very cost effective to really kind of hold your hand and do this on your own. You can take a genetic report, you understand what your genetic type is, determine what gene variants you have that are the priorities in that, and then more importantly, what do you do about it, right? How do you support those gene variants through dietary aspects, through supplemental components? What are maybe some of the key labs that need to be on your radar to look at to really kind of test and monitor the clinical relevance of your genetic predisposition to determine how effective what you're doing is working, besides how you're feeling and functioning day in, day out. So we put a lot of work into the your genetic type concept. We put together courses. We did a summit a couple months ago that was geared to it. We're working on book aspect with that. So it's something that is really designed for just somebody that's listened to this is all new, or hey, they want to be able to kind of take their health in their own hands and really get an understanding and really determine what are the next steps that they can do on their own to kind of start the process. That's what the Your Genetic Type concept is all about.
Yeah, that's awesome recap. And I find that's the case. Like I do a lot of DMs or direct messages to people on social media, and they inquire about, well, what's this genetic component? I've done every single test and I've done 23andMe, and then I'll ask them, well, has anyone ever explained it to you? And they said, well, I uploaded it to a chart on my own, and then they cross that off their list and say, I've gotten all the juice out of the squeeze that I can, right, when you haven't. There's so much more information there. And it's not so much to say, hey, you're screwed, your genetics are bad. It just means, like you said earlier, where are the bottlenecks? And then once we understand those bottlenecks, then we don't have to come up with a generic take this or take that, but we can specifically say to you, these are the things that you should be supporting. And have you been supporting that? No. Well, that is the 1 or 2 or 5 degree change that you need to make to be able to really move the needle and to be able to really get the results that you're looking for. Just as a aside, John, any one specific client or case study that you can talk about with a toxic accumulator, with a couple of changes that you may have made and what the results may have, not to put you on the spot or anything, but anything that leaps out in your mind?
Well, I could give a kind of a generalization, because this is, kind of a classic scenario I see a lot of times where, somebody knows that they have like a heavy metal issue, right? And it could be any chemical component, right? It could be a mold issue or a heavy metal issue, but heavy metals is something I see a lot where they know that they've got mercury issues, aluminum, and they tried to do detoxification, or they tried to do like IV chelation. Yeah, and basically it's like they fell apart, right? It's like they couldn't tolerate it. It made them 10 times worse. And really what it comes down to is looking at the genetic aspect of that for that person individually, right? Understanding why they had a poor response to it. And then from there, supporting where those weak links in the chain or where that highway narrows down, and supporting it pretty aggressively, and then coming back to some of the things they did previously they didn't tolerate. And what's really cool to see is somebody kind of has this fear, like, oh, I did oral chelation, or I did IV chelation therapy, I did IV Myers cocktail, and I just completely fell apart, right? Now you understand that individual's genetic predisposition, and you support some of those missing pieces, and now their biochemistries function at a more optimal level, and now they go back to those things they did previously where they fell apart, and they have a completely different response, right? And now we're actually finally able to get the needle moving in terms of really getting a little more aggressive on detoxification aspects, to start clearing the metals, to start clearing the chemicals, to start clearing the stored mold in their body at a completely different level that they were able to previously, just because we kind of looked at genetic factors that were individual to them and understood how that person's biochemistry works or doesn't work, and supported accordingly. And now things are moving from point A to Z more effectively, and their body can now tolerate going in and squeezing, a little bit more of those chemicals out of the tissues at a rate that their body can tolerate now. And that's what's great to see. And this is something all the time I see where it's like, okay, hey, we need to come back and detoxify metals. They're scared to death. It's like, hey, we'll start slow and work up, and the response is completely different the next time around. And that's really great, because now we know we're removing traffic off the highway, and then long term, that's just going to set them up for a better quality of life going forward.
That's an awesome point. Yeah, when you think about it, where clients were close on the path, but it wasn't as specific, or was it in the right order or priority. and then you revisit what they had done in the past once you've gone back and foundationally fixed some of those challenges, and then you do the same thing, and now they're tolerating it better, they're actually seeing improvements. That's a great point, John. Yeah. As well as yeah, it's a therapeutic and diagnostic approach, right? Because you're also getting an understanding that, hey, I did this before, but I never had the success with it. And I think a lot of people need to keep digging, in that analogy of acres of diamonds, where they stop digging because they just don't find the treasure point deep enough. But then they learn to dig somewhere a little bit differently, but still going downwards till eventually they hit that analogy of discovering that pay dirt and getting the results. So just to summarize, where do they go to take the quiz, and what's the next step for them?
Yeah, so, to take the quiz, you can go to yourgenetictype.com. It's a free quiz. It's 35 questions. After you take that quiz, it's going to give you a result and tell you what your core genetic type is. And then from there, I encourage you to explore the website. You'll see, our shop on there that has some of these tests, like the functional genomic analysis test available, as well as, courses to take our Your Genetic Type Unlock course. It can really hold your hand through understanding this genetic information. And to me, these tools are completely life-changing, and the value on them is just amazing. The content you get, it can really, really give you a better understanding of how this information, especially understanding from a personalized or individual standpoint, how your specific gene or genetic predisposition can be that missing piece of the puzzle.
Awesome information, John, as always. And so from Dr. John Thomas and Dr. Joel Rosen from Your Genetic Type, we look forward to helping you take control of your biology and get results faster. And we'll see you on the next edition of Your Genetic Type. Take care and have